The dreamer in the classroom. The old ceiling fan creaked overhead, spinning lazily against the humid afternoon air. The walls of the classroom were lined with peeling posters about great explorers and mathematicians, but none of them looked like Cairo. He sat at his wooden desk, his hands gripping the edges as he waited for his turn to speak. The anticipation curled in his stomach, a mix of excitement and nervousness. Mrs. Lawson, the middle-aged teacher with graying curls, stood at the front of the classroom, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "All right, class," she said in her usual firm tone, "today, we are sharing our future careers. Stand up, say it loud, and be proud." One by one, the students rose from their chairs. "I want to be a soccer player. A singer. A lawyer." The classroom buzzed with interest, some students nodding in approval, others offering half-hearted claps. Then, it was Cairo's turn. He took a deep breath and stood. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let fear steal his moment. He had practiced this at home, looking in the mirror, picturing himself in a white coat. "When I grow up," he began, "I want to be a doctor." For a brief, fleeting moment, silence blanketed the room. Cairo held his breath, thinking maybe, just maybe, they would take him seriously. Then, it began. Laughter. It started with a single snicker, then spread like wildfire. The room erupted with giggles, sneers, and outright guffaws. "A doctor?" Malcolm, the class bully, smirked. "Man, you can barely afford lunch, and you think you're gonna be a doctor?" Another kid, Tamara, shook her head. "Doctors have to be, like, geniuses. You sure you're smart enough?" Even the usually quiet kids exchanged amused glances. Cairo's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay still. The heat of humiliation crept up his neck, but he swallowed the lump in his throat. He turned to Mrs. Lawson, expecting, no, hoping, for some reassurance. But instead of shutting down the ridicule, she smiled, the corners of her mouth twitching like she was holding back her own laughter. All right, settle down," she said, though the amusement in her voice was evident. She turned to Cairo. "Dreams are good, but sometimes, we need to be realistic, don't we?" Realistic. The word struck Cairo harder than any of Malcolm's taunts. It was one thing for his classmates to laugh. They were kids. They didn't know any better. But Mrs. Lawson? A teacher? The person who was supposed to encourage him? He felt like the floor had been ripped from under him. "I am serious," Cairo muttered, his voice shaking slightly. "I want to help people. I want to save lives." Malcolm snorted. "Yeah? You gonna be a doctor with what money? Your parents are broke." The class erupted again. Cairo's ears burned, but he refused to let them see him break. Mrs. Lawson clapped her hands together. "All right, that's enough. Let's move on." Just like that, his dream was dismissed. Cairo sat back down, his body rigid. He refused to look at anyone. He focused on the chipped wood of his desk, tracing the small carvings of initials left by students before him. The laughter eventually faded, but the sting of it stayed. That afternoon, as Cairo walked home, his mind replayed the moment over and over again. The laughter. The mocking. The disappointment in Mrs. Lawson's voice. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks. His neighborhood wasn't the worst, but it wasn't the best either. Small, worn-down houses lined the streets, kids played barefoot on the road, and old men sat on their porches, chatting about the latest news. Cairo kicked a loose stone as he walked, frustration boiling in his chest. "Why do they think it's so impossible?" he muttered under his breath. "Why does everyone think I can't do it?" When he reached his house, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, exhausted from another long day of cleaning houses. She looked up as he entered, her tired eyes immediately sharpening with concern. "Cairo? What's wrong?" He hesitated. His mother had enough on her plate. He didn't want to burden her with his problems. But the weight of the day was too heavy. "They laughed at me," he admitted, "when I told them I wanted to be a doctor." His mother's lips pressed together in a firm line. She set down the cup of tea she had been holding and straightened. "Who?" "Everyone. The whole class. Even Mrs. Lawson." Her face darkened. "Your teacher?" Cairo nodded. "She said I should be realistic. Like it's just some silly dream." For a long moment, his mother didn't speak. Then, she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "Cairo, listen to me." Her voice was steady, but there was a fire behind her words. "People will always doubt you. Especially when you come from where we do. But their doubts don't define you. You define you." He swallowed hard. "But what if they're right? We don't have money for college. We don't have connections. And what if I'm not smart enough?" His mother squeezed his hands. "Cairo, do you know what being a doctor takes?" He nodded. "Hard work." "Exactly." She leaned forward. "And you? You are the hardest worker I know. You help me when I'm too tired to stand. You take care of your little sister. You study even when no one's watching. You think those rich kids at school work harder than you?" Cairo shook his head. "You have something no amount of money can buy, determination," his mother continued. "You will have to fight, my son. Harder than anyone else. But if you want this, if you truly want this, you don't let them tell you no." Cairo inhaled sharply. His mother's words settled deep inside him, planting a seed. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let their laughter stop him. He wouldn't let their disbelief become his truth. One day, he would walk back into that classroom. Not as the boy they mocked, but as the doctor they never believed he could be. And that would be his greatest revenge. The road of struggles. Cairo woke up before the sun. He had to, there was no other way. His mother's words from the night before still echoed in his mind, "You have something no amount of money can buy, determination." That determination was the only thing that kept him moving. He rolled out of bed quietly, careful not to wake his younger sister, Amina, who lay curled under a thin blanket on the other side of their tiny shared room. Their house wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a leaking roof, and a kitchen that smelled of spices and home. But it was theirs. In the dim light, Cairo grabbed his tattered notebook and the one textbook he had borrowed from the school library. His desk. The kitchen table. His chair. The same stool his mother sat on after long days of cleaning. By the time his mother shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes, he was already deep in his studies. She gave him a tired smile. "You're up early again." Cairo didn't look up. "I have to be." She poured water into a pot, setting it on the small gas stove. "You're going to burn yourself out, my son." He shook his head. "I can't afford to." His mother sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she slid a plate of bread and eggs in front of him. "Eat," she insisted. "A doctor can't save lives on an empty stomach." Cairo smiled slightly and took a bite, but his mind was already on the school day ahead. At school, things didn't get any easier. His classmates had mostly moved on from their laughter, but the whispers remained. He still thinks he's gonna be a doctor? He should just give up already. Why is he even trying so hard? The teachers weren't much better. While some encouraged him, others, like Mrs. Lawson, still saw him as the boy from a struggling family with unrealistic dreams. "Cairo, maybe you should consider a trade school," his guidance counselor suggested one afternoon. Doctors go to college for a long time. It's expensive. Have you thought about something more practical? Cairo clenched his fists under the table. I want to be a doctor. The counselor sighed, shaking her head. I just don't want you to be disappointed, Cairo. People from our community, they don't usually. Maybe because no one believes in them. She fell silent. Cairo walked out of her office without another word. The real battle, though, wasn't just in the classroom, it was at home. His mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at a small diner at night. His father, who used to be a factory worker, had gotten injured years ago and couldn't work the same way anymore. Bills stacked up, and money was always tight. So Cairo did what he had to do. After school, while other kids hung out or played video games, he went straight to the diner where his mother worked and took a shift washing dishes. The pay was meager, but every cent counted. Some nights, he came home so exhausted that he barely had the energy to open his textbooks. But he forced himself to. Because every time he thought about quitting, he remembered the laughter. He remembered Mrs. Lawson's smirk. Be realistic. No. He would prove them all wrong. By the time Cairo reached high school, his reputation had changed. The same students who used to mock him now just shook their heads in disbelief. He's still trying. But there was something else, too, resentment. Why does he work so hard? Malcolm sneered one afternoon in the cafeteria. It's not like he's special. Tamara, who had once laughed at his dream, crossed her arms. He just thinks he's better than us. Cairo overheard them, but he didn't react. He had learned something important. The more you rise, the more people want to pull you down. So he kept his head down and pushed forward. By senior year, Cairo had done the impossible. He had earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. The day the acceptance letter arrived, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at it for what felt like hours. His mother wiped her hands on her apron, looking over his shoulder. Well? Cairo swallowed. I got in. For the first time in a long time, he saw tears in his mother's eyes. She pulled him into a tight embrace. I knew you would. His father, usually a quiet man, clapped him on the back. You've made us proud, son. But the reality of his success hit just as quickly. The scholarship covered tuition, but not everything else. Rent, books, food, those were still problems. Cairo knew what that meant. He would have to work twice as hard. And so, when he left for college, he did just that. He took up 2 part-time jobs, one as a library assistant, the other as a night janitor. During the day, he studied relentlessly. While other students partied, he memorized anatomy charts. While they slept, he reviewed case studies. There were nights he broke down, wondering if he had made a mistake. Am I really meant to be here? But then he remembered. The laughter. The doubt. The people who said he couldn't. And that was enough to keep him going. By the time he graduated, Cairo wasn't just another student. He was at the top of his class. And when he walked across that stage in his cap and gown, he didn't just see the thousands of faces in the crowd. He saw that old classroom. He saw Malcolm. He saw Mrs. Lawson. And he smiled. Because he had won. But little did he know. His biggest test was yet to come. Against all odds. The moment Cairo stepped into medical school, he knew he was in a different world. The air smelled of fresh textbooks, polished floors, and expensive coffee. Around him, students carried the latest tablets, wore designer clothes, and spoke in confident voices about their family connections in the medical field. Cairo, on the other hand, walked in with a second-hand laptop, a backpack with a broken zipper, and the weight of an entire community on his shoulders. He had fought tooth and nail to get here. But stepping through the doors of his new reality, he realized something chilling: getting in was only the first battle. A harsh welcome. On the first day of classes, Cairo found himself in a massive lecture hall filled with students who seemed effortlessly at home. He took a seat near the middle, unfolding his notebook while the professor, an older man with glasses, shuffled papers at the front. "Welcome to your first year of medical school," the professor began. "Look around you. Some of you will not be here by the end of the year. Medical school is not for the weak. It will break you. If you don't have the resilience for it, leave now." Cairo swallowed hard. He glanced around and noticed something. Most of the students looked relaxed, even amused. They weren't worried. They had grown up knowing they would be here one day. Cairo had spent his entire life fighting just to get this far. He would not let it slip through his fingers. The struggle begins. From the very first week, it was clear, medical school was nothing like high school or college. The material was relentless. One lecture covered more information than an entire month of high school. Anatomy, physiology, pathology, the words blurred together in thick, heavy textbooks that never seemed to end. Cairo studied harder than he ever had before. He spent entire nights in the library, his fingers aching from taking notes, his eyes burning from exhaustion. But no matter how much he tried, he always felt behind. During one particularly difficult class on the cardiovascular system, the professor fired questions at the students. "Katie, what happens during ventricular fibrillation?" A girl in the front row answered instantly, rattling off medical terms as if she had been born knowing them. "Excellent," the professor said. "Now, Cairo, can you tell me the primary function of the sinoatrial node?" Cairo's brain stuttered. He knew this. He had studied it. But under pressure, his mind went blank. The silence stretched. "Cairo?" the professor prompted, an eyebrow raised. He scrambled to recall the answer. It's the pacemaker of the heart," he stammered. "Correct," the professor said, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. "But in this field, hesitation costs lives. Know your material inside and out." Heat crept up Cairo's neck. He clenched his fists under the table, shame burning through him. The moment class ended, Malcolm, yes, that Malcolm, came up to him. Because, as fate would have it, Malcolm had also gotten into medical school. "I see you're still struggling," Malcolm said with a smirk. "Man, you sure you belong here?" Cairo ignored him. He had dealt with worse. Loneliness and doubt. Outside the classroom, things weren't any easier. While other students formed study groups, Cairo often found himself alone. Many of his classmates came from families of doctors, so they stuck together. They shared resources, quizzed each other, and exchanged notes. Cairo? No one invited him to their study sessions. One afternoon, he approached a group reviewing notes in the library. "Hey, do you guys mind if I join?" They exchanged glances. A girl with perfectly straightened hair sighed. We already have a full group." "Yeah," another guy added. "It's just easier with people who, work at the same pace." Cairo got the message. He walked away, but their whispers followed. "He won't last. I don't know why he even bothers." That night, he sat alone in his dorm room, staring at his open textbooks but unable to read. For the first time in years, doubt crept in. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe Mrs. Lawson was right. Maybe I should quit. But then, a memory flashed in his mind, his mother, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, saying, "You will have to fight, my son. Harder than anyone else." Cairo exhaled and wiped his eyes. He had come too far to quit now. Fighting back. Determined to prove himself, Cairo found new ways to learn. Since no one wanted to study with him, he spent extra time in the library. He recorded lectures and listened to them while working his janitor job at night. When the material felt impossible, he broke it down into simpler concepts, writing key points on sticky notes and placing them all over his dorm room. He forced himself to learn. And slowly, it started to work. His grades improved. His confidence grew. By the end of the semester, during an anatomy practical exam, something incredible happened. The professor asked a question, one that had the entire class stumped. Silence filled the room. Then, Cairo spoke up. "That's the vagus nerve," he said confidently. "It regulates heart rate and digestion through parasympathetic control." The professor looked at him for a moment. Then, he nodded. "Very good, Mr. Adeyemi." For the first time, Cairo felt something shift. Respect. Proving them wrong. By his second year, everything changed. Cairo had fought through the worst of it. He had pushed past the whispers, the doubt, the loneliness. And now? Now, he was excelling. His name was on the dean's list. Professors called on him with confidence instead of doubt. The same students who had once refused to study with him now asked him for help. One day, Malcolm approached him after class, looking hesitant. "Hey, man," Malcolm said, rubbing the back of his neck. You got a minute?" Cairo raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. I'm struggling with neuroanatomy. I heard you're really good at it. Think you could help me out?" Cairo stared at him for a long moment. He remembered the laughter, the insults, the taunts. A part of him wanted to throw Malcolm's words back at him. "You sure you belong here?" But instead, Cairo simply nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Come by the library later. I'll go over it with you." Malcolm looked surprised. "Thanks, man." As he walked away, Cairo smiled to himself. Because he realized something. His success wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about proving himself right. The return. The city hospital hummed with the steady rhythm of life and death. Machines beeped in the background, doctors rushed down brightly lit corridors, and the scent of antiseptics clung to the air. Dr. Cairo Adeyemi barely noticed any of it. He was used to the chaos now, the emergencies, the difficult cases, the weight of life in his hands. But today, the call he received shook him in a way nothing else had before. It was from home. A mysterious illness was spreading through his old neighborhood. People were collapsing, fevers raging, coughing so violently that their ribs ached. The small community clinic was overwhelmed, and there weren't enough doctors to help. Cairo hesitated for only a moment. Then, he packed his bags. He had spent years running away from that place. The streets where he had been mocked. The school where they had laughed at him. But now, they needed him. And he would go back, not as the boy they had doubted, but as the doctor they never thought he could be. Homecoming. The drive back felt surreal. The familiar streets blurred past his window, cracked sidewalks, old storefronts, houses with sagging porches. It was as if nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. As he pulled into the community clinic's parking lot, his heart pounded. Would they even recognize him? Would they still see him as the poor kid with big dreams? Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car. Inside, the waiting area was packed. People clutched their chests, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. Some coughed violently into handkerchiefs. Others sat motionless, their eyes glazed over with exhaustion. Nurses rushed from one patient to another, their faces tight with stress. And then, he saw her. Mrs. Lawson. The same teacher who had smirked when he said he wanted to be a doctor. She was slumped in a chair, her breathing labored, her hands trembling. Cairo felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, pity, justice. And then he saw Malcolm. The former class bully sat in a corner, his usual arrogance stripped away, replaced by fear. His younger sister clung to his arm, her small body shaking with fever. "Cairo?" The voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. He turned and saw Tamara, the girl who had once sneered at his dreams. Her eyes widened in shock. You're a doctor?" Cairo didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just grabbed his stethoscope and got to work. Fighting the storm. The next 48 hours were a blur. Cairo barely slept, barely ate. He examined patient after patient, working alongside the overburdened clinic staff, trying to diagnose the illness. It wasn't just a seasonal flu, it was something worse. The symptoms were aggressive, unpredictable. Some patients improved, only to relapse. Resources were scarce. They were running out of 4 fluids. They didn't have enough ventilators. Cairo felt the pressure mounting. But he refused to break. Late into the night, he sat in the clinic's tiny office, poring over patient charts. He analyzed the patterns, cross-checked symptoms, studied every detail. And then, it clicked. The illness was bacterial, not viral. The antibiotics they had been using weren't strong enough. A new treatment plan had to be implemented. Immediately. Cairo rushed to the head nurse, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a tired expression. "I need access to stronger antibiotics," he told her. "We need them now." She hesitated. "We don't have enough." "Then we get them," Cairo said firmly. "Call every nearby hospital. Every pharmacy. We have to move fast." The nurse stared at him for a moment. Then, nodding, she picked up the phone. For the first time since he had arrived, Cairo felt something shift. They were listening to him. Not as a former student. Not as a poor kid from the neighborhood. But as a doctor. Tables turned. The next morning, the stronger antibiotics arrived. The change was almost immediate. The fevers began to break. Patients who had been struggling to breathe found relief. Even Malcolm's little sister, who had been one of the worst cases, started to improve. And then there was Mrs. Lawson. Cairo found her sitting upright in bed, looking frail but alert. When their eyes met, she cleared her throat. She hesitated. "I owe you an apology." Cairo raised an eyebrow. She sighed. "I remember when you stood in my classroom and said you wanted to be a doctor." He said nothing. She looked away, ashamed. "I didn't believe in you. And I was wrong." Cairo folded his arms. "Yes. You were." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Cairo nodded. "Get some rest." As he turned to leave, he saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Respect. The moment of truth. By the end of the week, the crisis had passed. Patients were recovering. The clinic was stabilizing. And the town knew exactly who had saved them. As Cairo packed his bag, preparing to return to the city, a knock sounded on the clinic's door. It was Malcolm. The once arrogant bully looked different now, humbled, nervous. "Cairo, wait," he said. Cairo crossed his arms. "What do you want?" Malcolm hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I wanted to say I was wrong." Cairo raised an eyebrow. Malcolm exhaled. "Back in school, I laughed at you. I said you'd never make it. I was a jerk. But, you proved me wrong. And you saved my sister." He looked down, ashamed. "So, thank you. And I'm sorry." For a long moment, Cairo said nothing. Then, finally, he extended his hand. Malcolm looked surprised, but he shook it. "Take care of your sister," Cairo said simply. And with that, he walked out of the clinic. A different kind of victory. As Cairo drove away, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The town that had once doubted him now stood as a testament to his success. They had laughed at him, mocked him, told him his dreams were impossible. And yet, when they needed help, he was the one they turned to. Not out of pity. Not out of desperation. But because he had earned it. Because he had become exactly what they never believed he could be. A doctor. A hero. And that was the greatest victory of all. The weight of forgiveness. The road stretched ahead of Cairo as he drove back toward the city, but his mind lingered on everything he had just experienced. The town that once doubted him had needed him the most. He should have felt victorious. He should have felt triumphant. But something heavy settled in his chest. Was it satisfaction? Justice? Or something else? The faces of his old classmates, his teacher, and even Malcolm flashed through his mind. Their apologies, their desperation, their realization that they had been wrong. And then there was his own reflection staring back at him in the rearview mirror. The boy they had laughed at was gone. But was he truly free of the scars they had left behind? The ripple effect. By the time Cairo arrived back at the hospital where he worked, the weight of the past week was catching up with him. He walked into the staff room, intending to sit down and breathe for a moment, but as soon as he stepped inside, he was met with an unexpected surprise. A small group of medical interns stood around a table, whispering in hushed voices. When they noticed him, they fell silent. One of them, a young man with neatly combed hair and an expensive watch, stepped forward. "Dr. Adeyemi, is it true?" he asked. Cairo frowned. "Is what true? That you went back to your old town and stopped a whole outbreak by yourself?" Cairo hesitated. He had no idea how the news had spread so quickly. He had left without fanfare, without telling anyone except his supervisor. "Not by myself," Cairo finally said. "The clinic staff worked just as hard as I did." "Yeah, but you figured out the cause," another intern chimed in. "You saved all those people." Cairo shifted uncomfortably. "I did what any doctor would do." The group exchanged glances, clearly impressed. For the first time, Cairo realized something. His story, the story of the boy who was doubted, who had nothing, who fought against the odds, was inspiring people. People who had never struggled the way he had now saw him as an example. And somewhere, out there, another kid who was being laughed at for having big dreams might hear his story and think, if he can do it, maybe I can too. An unexpected letter. That night, as Cairo finished his shift and headed home, his phone buzzed. A message. It was from an unknown number. "Dr. Adeyemi, I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything, but I need your help. Please. It's urgent. Malcolm." Cairo stared at the screen. Of all the people to reach out to him. Malcolm. The same Malcolm who had tormented him as a child. The same Malcolm who had mocked him in medical school. The same Malcolm who had apologized, yes, but was an apology ever enough? For a long moment, Cairo debated ignoring the message. But something in the tone of the text, the urgency, made him pause. Against his better judgment, he typed back. "What's wrong?" The reply came almost instantly. "It's my father. He's really sick, but he refuses to go to the hospital. He keeps saying it's just a cold, but it's getting worse. I don't know what to do." Cairo exhaled slowly. He could refuse. He could let Malcolm figure it out himself. Wouldn't that be justice? Wouldn't that be fair? But Cairo wasn't that kind of person. "Send me the address. I'll be there in an hour." Facing the past. When Cairo pulled up to Malcolm's house, the sight surprised him. The house was small, even smaller than the one Cairo had grown up in. It was old, the paint peeling, the windows slightly cracked. Cairo had always assumed Malcolm had been better off than him. He had always acted like he was. But standing there now, he realized that Malcolm had been struggling too, just in a different way. The door opened before Cairo could knock. Malcolm stood there, looking nothing like the arrogant bully Cairo remembered. His face was lined with worry, his eyes tired. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside. Cairo walked in, and immediately, he heard it. A deep, rattling cough. In the dimly lit living room, an older man sat hunched on a couch, his breathing labored. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. Cairo recognized the symptoms instantly. Pneumonia. And a bad case of it. Malcolm's father tried to wave him off. "I don't need a doctor," he croaked. "You don't have a choice," Cairo said, setting his bag down. "You're on the verge of respiratory failure." Malcolm's father muttered something under his breath, but he didn't resist as Cairo examined him. After a few minutes, Cairo turned to Malcolm. "He needs immediate hospitalization." Malcolm's face tightened. "He won't go. Then he could die." Silence. Cairo saw Malcolm's jaw clench. He turned to his father, his voice shaking. "Dad, please." The old man looked at his son. Then, finally, he exhaled. "All right. A different kind of healing." Cairo rode with them to the hospital. He made sure Malcolm's father was admitted, that he received the right treatment. And when everything settled, when Malcolm sat beside his father's hospital bed, exhausted but relieved, he looked up at Cairo. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. Cairo shrugged. "I did." Malcolm studied him for a long moment. "You're a better man than me," he admitted. "I don't think I would have helped me if I were you." Cairo didn't respond immediately. He thought back to all the years of humiliation, the doubt, the pain. Then he thought about his mother's words. "People will always doubt you. But their doubts don't define you. You define you." "You were a kid back then," Cairo finally said. "We all were. And we all had things to learn." Malcolm swallowed. "I'm still learning." Cairo gave him a small nod. "Good. The true meaning of success." A week later, Malcolm's father was discharged. Malcolm texted Cairo again. "He's better. Thank you." That was all. No grand gesture. No dramatic speeches. But it was enough. Because Cairo had realized something. Success wasn't about proving people wrong. It wasn't about revenge. It was about rising above. It was about helping, even those who had hurt you. Because at the end of the day, Cairo hadn't become a doctor to silence his doubters. He had become a doctor to heal. And in the process, he had healed himself, too. A legacy beyond laughter. The city lights glowed in the distance as Cairo stood on his apartment balcony, sipping his coffee. The events of the past weeks replayed in his mind, the outbreak in his hometown, Malcolm's unexpected plea, the moment Mrs. Lawson apologized. It should have felt like the perfect ending. But life didn't pause for reflection. Being a doctor meant new challenges every day, new lives to save, new battles to fight. And Cairo wasn't done yet. He had proven something to himself and to those who doubted him. But the real question now was, what next? A new path. The hospital where Cairo worked was one of the best in the city, filled with cutting-edge technology and some of the top doctors in the country. Yet, something gnawed at him. Here, patients had every resource they could need. They had specialists, equipment, access to the best medicine. But back home? Back in his old neighborhood, people still struggled to afford basic healthcare. People still died from preventable diseases because they couldn't see a doctor in time. The outbreak had proven it, there weren't enough hospitals in low-income areas. There weren't enough doctors willing to work in those communities. And Cairo had been one of them. For years, he had fought to escape that place. Now, he realized. Maybe he needed to go back. The decision that changed everything. The idea wouldn't leave him alone. One night, he sat down at his desk and grabbed a notebook. At the top of the page, he wrote, "What do they need?" Then, he listed every problem he had seen in his old neighborhood. Not enough doctors. Not enough clinics. Not enough free healthcare programs. Not enough trust in the system. Then, on the next page, he wrote, "What can I do about it?" The answer was simple. Start a clinic. Everyone said it was impossible, again. Cairo knew he couldn't do this alone. So he reached out to his colleagues, professors, and even former classmates. At first, the responses were underwhelming. "That's ambitious, Cairo, but it's a lot of work." "Starting a clinic? Do you know how expensive that is? Wouldn't you rather focus on advancing your career?" Even his old mentor, Dr. Patel, frowned when Cairo explained his plan. "Cairo, I admire your passion," he said. "But you're talking about building something from the ground up. It'll take years. It's a financial risk. You're still young, why not wait until you're more established?" Cairo understood the concerns. But he couldn't wait. Every day he delayed, someone back home was suffering without the care they needed. So, just like before, he started alone. He researched. He reached out to nonprofits, to government programs, to anyone who would listen. And slowly, things started happening. The first step. A year later, Cairo stood in front of a small building. It wasn't fancy. The walls needed fresh paint. The equipment was donated. The waiting room had just a few chairs. But it was his clinic. It was real. And the first patient that walked through the door? Mrs. Lawson. Cairo blinked in surprise as she hesitated in the doorway. Dr. Adeyemi, she corrected herself, smiling sheepishly. "I heard about what you were doing. I had to come see it myself." Cairo gestured toward the exam room. "You here for a checkup?" She laughed lightly. "No, actually, I suppose I could use one. But more than that, I wanted to say something." Cairo leaned against the desk, waiting. "You know, I spent my whole career telling kids to dream within their limits," she admitted. "Telling them to be realistic. To not reach too high." Cairo's lips pressed together, but he said nothing. Mrs. Lawson sighed. "I see now how wrong I was. You are proof that limits only exist if we accept them." She smiled. "And I have a feeling that, because of you, more kids will dare to dream big." Cairo exhaled. The weight of the past seemed to lift, just a little. "Thank you," he said quietly. She shook his hand. "No. Thank you." Word spreads. Over the next few months, the clinic grew. More patients came. Some traveled from nearby towns. Then, an article was published about the doctor who came back. People started donating. More doctors reached out, offering to volunteer. And one day, to Cairo's shock, Malcolm walked in, wearing a white coat. Cairo blinked. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm grinned. "Well, I figured I owed you. Thought I'd come help out." "You're a doctor now?" Malcolm smirked. "Yeah. Turns out I actually passed medical school." Cairo chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day." "Me neither," Malcolm admitted. "But you showed me something back then." You showed me what it means to really care about people. To really make a difference. He extended his hand. So, do you need an extra set of hands? Cairo stared at him for a long moment. Then, he shook Malcolm's hand. Welcome to the team. A legacy begins. The years passed. Cairo's clinic expanded. It became more than just a small office, it became a foundation, a program that helped train future doctors from underserved communities. And soon, something incredible happened. A new generation of kids started dreaming bigger. Kids from his old school. Kids who had once been told, be realistic. They weren't just dreaming about being athletes or entertainers anymore. They were dreaming of becoming doctors. And when they asked, can I do it? People pointed to Dr. Cairo Adeyemi. The boy they once laughed at. The boy who never stopped believing. And the doctor who changed everything. The final lesson. One evening, Cairo stood outside his clinic, watching the sunset. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. You define you. She had been right. He hadn't just proven people wrong. He had changed lives. And that? That was the greatest victory of all.